James Holden stared at the foreclosure notice in his trembling hands, the weight of 3 generations of family farming crumbling around him. Tomorrow, he'd have to start selling his animals, the livestock he'd raised from birth, treated with care despite his financial struggles. What he didn't know was that the mud-caked border collie he just untangled from his fence belonged to someone who would change everything. He didn't recognize the approaching woman in expensive hiking boots and a camera around her neck. He didn't know she had millions of followers waiting to hear about farms just like his. He didn't know that by saving her dog, he might have just saved his entire legacy. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Tomorrow's story will touch your heart even more, so you won't want to miss it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across James Holden's struggling farm as he trudged through the muddy field toward the fence line. Rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the earth into a soggy mess and doing nothing to improve his mood. The past few years had been increasingly difficult, with rising feed costs, equipment breaking down, and market prices dropping. At 43, the weathered lines on his face told the story of hard work and mounting worries. James pulled his worn cap lower over his eyes, squinting at the distant shape caught in his fence. From here, it looked like a clump of debris, probably blown in during last night's storm. But as he drew closer, he realized it was moving. The sharp bark that suddenly cut through the air made him quicken his pace. A border collie, its black and white coat matted with mud, was tangled in the lower section of wire fencing. The dog's leg was caught between 2 wires, and despite its obvious pain, it wagged its tail weakly when it saw James approaching. "Hey there, buddy," James said, keeping his voice low and gentle as he knelt in the mud. "Got yourself into a bit of trouble, didn't you?" The dog whimpered but remained still as James carefully examined the situation. The wire had cut into the animal's leg, not deeply, but enough to draw blood. James could see fear in the intelligent brown eyes watching him, but also a spark of trust. "I'm going to help you out," he promised, reaching into his pocket for the wire cutters he always carried. "Just stay still for me." Working methodically, James snipped the wire and gently freed the dog's leg. Once released, the collie didn't bolt as expected, but stayed sitting, panting heavily, watching James with what seemed like gratitude. "You're welcome," James said, noticing the dog wore a collar, though no tags were visible through the caked-on mud. "Let's get you cleaned up and see who you belong to." He scooped up the medium-sized dog, surprised at how light it felt in his arms. The animal didn't struggle, but instead seemed to relax against his chest as James carried it back toward the farmhouse. The Holden family farm had seen better days. The white paint on the 2-story farmhouse was peeling, and several shutters hung crookedly from windows. The barn, once a proud structure of solid oak, now leaned slightly to one side, its red paint faded to a dull rust color. Several pieces of equipment sat idle in the yard, some covered in tarps, others simply left to weather the elements because James couldn't afford to fix them. Inside the mudroom at the back of the house, James set the dog down on an old towel and filled a basin with warm water. The foreclosure notice he'd received that morning sat on the kitchen table, its official letterhead and cold legal language, a death knell for everything he'd worked for. The dog watched curiously as James began to gently wash the mud from its coat. "I don't have much, but I can spare some water and food for you," he told the animal. "Tomorrow I start selling off the animals. Thanks calling in the loans." James wasn't sure why he was talking to the dog, but there was something therapeutic about voicing the thoughts he'd kept bottled inside for months. The collie's ears perked up at his words, head tilting as if truly listening. "Dad left me this place thinking I'd make it work." James worked his fingers through a particularly stubborn clump of mud on the dog's neck. "Granddad started it, Dad expanded it, and I'm the one who's going to lose it all. Some legacy, huh?" As he cleaned away the mud, James discovered a tag on the collar with a phone number but no name. The dog's leg had a nasty cut, but it didn't appear to need stitches. After drying the collie off, James led it to the kitchen where he placed a bowl of water and some leftover roast beef on the floor. "Eat up while I call your owner," he said, reaching for his old cordless phone. "Someone's probably worried sick about you." The number rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, breathless with hope. "Hello? Have you found him?" "If you're missing a border collie, then yes, man," James replied. "Found him caught in my fence line. He's got a cut on his leg, but otherwise seems okay." "Oh, thank God." The relief in her voice was palpable. "I'd been searching for hours. My name is Alexandra Winters. I was hiking the trails near Riverbed Road when he took off after something. That's about half a mile from my property," James said. "I'm James Holden. My farm is at 1426 County Line Road. I know exactly where that is," Alexandra said quickly. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. And thank you, Mr. Holden. Max means everything to me." After hanging up, James looked down at the dog Max, who had devoured the roast beef and was now lapping water enthusiastically. "Well, Max, your mom's on her way. Sounds like she really missed you." While waiting, James found himself tidying up the kitchen, suddenly aware of how a stranger might view his home. The house had once been warm and welcoming when his mother was alive, but since her passing 5 years ago, James had let things slide. He lived alone now, and with financial pressures mounting, housekeeping had fallen to the bottom of his priority list. The sound of tires on gravel announced Alexandra's arrival. James stepped onto the porch just as a sleek black SUV pulled up beside his rusted pickup truck. The contrast between the vehicles was stark, one a symbol of prosperity, the other of struggle. The woman who emerged from the SUV was not what James had expected. Alexandra Winters appeared to be in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking boots, cargo pants, and a light jacket with multiple pockets. A professional-looking camera hung around her neck. There was an air of confidence about her that made James suddenly conscious of his mud-stained jeans and work-worn hands. "Max!" Alexandra called, and from behind James, the border collie darted past, barking excitedly as he ran to his owner. Alexandra knelt, embracing the dog with obvious relief, checking him over with careful hands. "You scared me half to death," she scolded gently before looking up at James. "Thank you so much for helping him. I saw the cut on his leg. Did you clean it?" James nodded, stepping down from the porch. "Just washed it out. Doesn't look too deep." Alexandra stood, offering her hand. "I'm Alex. I can't thank you enough." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and James found himself warming to her immediate frankness. "James. And it was no trouble. He's a good dog." "He's usually more obedient," Alex said, glancing around the farm with interest. "We were documenting wildlife along the creek when he suddenly bolted after something. I think it might have been a rabbit." The word, documenting, caught James's attention. "You're a photographer?" Alex hesitated for just a moment. "Among other things, I work with various environmental and animal welfare organizations. I document ecosystems, wildlife habitats, that sort of thing." James felt a flicker of unease. Environmental organizations weren't always viewed favorably by farmers in the area, who often felt targeted by regulations and restrictions that made their already difficult livelihoods more challenging. "I see," he said, his tone cooler than before. Alex seemed to sense his withdrawal. "I'm interested in sustainable practices and finding balance," she clarified. "Not in shutting down family farms, if that's what you're thinking." James was saved from responding by Max, who had wandered over to the barn and was now barking at something inside. Alex called him back, but the dog continued to bark consistently. "He's probably spotted one of the barn cats," James explained, walking toward the sound. "They're a bit territorial." Alex followed, her camera now in her hands rather than around her neck. "You have cats?" "Working cats," James emphasized. "They keep the rodent population down, essential on a farm this size." He pushed open the barn door, letting light spill into the dusty interior. The barn housed several stalls, most containing livestock. 2 dairy cows, a small flock of sheep, and a few goats made up James's modest animal collection. In the far corner, a mother cat and 4 kittens were huddled on a pile of clean straw, eyeing Max with suspicion. "Oh," Alex breathed, lifting her camera. "May I?" James nodded, watching as she approached the cat family slowly, kneeling a respectful distance away to take photos. Her movements were practiced and gentle, and the mother cat, though watchful, didn't flee. "They're beautiful," Alex said, reviewing the images on her camera screen. "How old are the kittens?" "About 6 weeks," James answered. "The mother showed up pregnant a couple months ago. I've been trying to find homes for them." Alex spent several minutes photographing the cats before standing up and turning her attention to the other animals. "Your setup here is interesting," she observed, moving toward the cow stalls. "These stalls are larger than what I typically see." James shrugged. "Animals need space. Even if they're livestock, they deserve decent living conditions." Something in Alex's expression shifted, a spark of interest igniting in her eyes. "That's not a sentiment I hear from every farmer." "Maybe you're talking to the wrong farmers," James replied, then immediately regretted his defensive tone. "Sorry. It's been a rough day." Alex lowered her camera. "No need to apologize. And you're right, I've seen operations where profit margins dictate everything, squeezing animals into spaces too small for their well-being." She gestured around. "This is different. You clearly care." Her observation, though causative, only served to intensify James's sense of failure. He cared, yes, but caring hadn't been enough to save his farm. "Well," he said, moving toward the barn door, "it was nice meeting you, but I've got work to finish before dark." Alex seemed reluctant to leave. "Of course. I don't want to keep you." She whistled for Max, who had been investigating a stack of hay bales. "Thank you again for helping, Max. I'd like to repay you somehow." James shook his head. "Not necessary. At least let me cover any costs for cleaning his wound," she insisted, reaching for her purse. "Really? It was just some water and a bit of hydrogen peroxide," James said firmly. "I'm glad he's okay." Alex studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever need anything, please call. I mean it." James accepted the card automatically, glancing down at it. "Alexandra Winters, Wildlife Preservation and Animal Advocacy," he read aloud. Below her name was the logo for a well-known animal rights organization. His expression must have changed, because Alex quickly added, "I'm not here to judge your farm, James. What I saw today tells me you care about animals. That matters to me." James pocketed the card without comment. "Drive safe," he said, watching as she clipped a leash to Max's collar and led him back to the SUV. As the vehicle disappeared down the driveway, James found himself feeling strangely unsettled by the encounter. There had been something about Alexandra Winters, a genuine quality, that didn't fit with his preconceived notion of animal rights activists. The way she'd looked at his farm hadn't been with condemnation, but with a curious interest. Returning to the house, James pulled out her business card again. Underneath her name and title was a website address, and on impulse, he turned on his ancient desktop computer to look it up. The computer wheezed to life slowly, the internet connection equally sluggish. When Alexandra's website finally loaded, James found himself looking at a professional page featuring stunning wildlife photography, articles on animal welfare, and a biography section. Alexandra Winters wasn't just any activist, she was renowned in her field, with a substantial following on social media platforms and regular features in national magazines. One particular section caught his eye: sustainable farming initiatives. Clicking through, James discovered articles and photo essays about small farms across the country that had successfully implemented animal welfare practices while remaining profitable. These weren't glossy, idealistic portrayals, but practical examinations of the challenges and solutions faced by real farmers. James was still scrolling through the articles when his phone rang. It was Patrick Reynolds, his bank manager, calling to confirm their meeting tomorrow to discuss the transition plan for the farm, a euphemism for the systematic dismantling of everything James had worked for. "Yes, I'll be there," James confirmed, his voice flat. 9 o'clock. After hanging up, he stared at the computer screen where Alexandra's website was still open. An idea began to form in his mind, desperate perhaps, but he had nothing left to lose. Picking up the phone again, he dialed the number on her business card. When she answered, he spoke before he could change his mind. "Ms. Winters, It's James Holden. I helped your dog today. I was wondering if you might be interested in seeing more of the farm. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." There was a brief pause before Alexandra replied, curiosity evident in her voice. "I'd like that very much, James. When would be a good time? Tomorrow afternoon?" James suggested. "Around 3? I'll be there," she promised. After hanging up, James looked around his kitchen, at the foreclosure notice still lying on the table, and wondered if he was grasping at straws. Whatever Alexandra Winters might think of his operation, it seemed unlikely she could offer any solution to his financial crisis. Still, the desperate situation called for desperate measures. The next morning, James drove to the bank with a knot in his stomach. The meeting with Patrick Reynolds went exactly as expected, compassionate noises about the difficulty of the situation, followed by firm insistence on the bank's need to recover their investment. "We can give you 30 days to sell the livestock yourself," Patrick offered, sliding papers across his desk. "That way, you might get better prices than at auction. After that, we'll need to proceed with the sale of the property and equipment." James stared at the documents, his chest tight. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. Patrick had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I know, James, but you've been behind on payments for almost a year now. The bank has been patient, but business is business," James finished for him. "I understand." He signed the papers with a leaden hand, each stroke of the pen feeling like another nail in the coffin of his family's legacy. Driving back to the farm, he tried to focus on practical matters. Which animals should he sell first? What equipment could fetch a decent price? Where would he go after the farm was sold? By the time 3 o'clock approached, James had worked himself into a state of exhausted resignation. He'd spent the morning making calls to potential buyers for his livestock, each conversation driving home the reality of his situation. The sound of Alexandra's SUV pulling into the driveway almost came as a relief, a brief distraction from the crushing weight of his problems. Today she wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, her camera again hanging around her neck. Max bounded out of the vehicle beside her, apparently eager to revisit the farm. "Thanks for inviting me back," Alex said as she approached. "I was hoping to get another look at your operation. It's not often I see a conventional farm with such attention to animal comfort." James attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me give you the full tour then." For the next hour, James led Alexandra through every aspect of his farm. He showed her the pastures where his small herd of cattle grazed in rotation, the chicken coop where hens had access to both shelter and open space, and the vegetable garden he maintained primarily for his own use. Throughout the tour, Alex took photos and asked insightful questions about his practices and philosophies. "You mentioned yesterday that things have been rough," she said carefully, as they walked back toward the house. "If you don't mind my asking, what sort of challenges are you facing?" The question was asked with such genuine interest that James found himself answering honestly. "Everything, really. Equipment breaking down, feed costs rising, market prices dropping. Small farms like mine can't compete with the big operations anymore." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "It's a common story, unfortunately. The system seems designed to push out family farms in favor of industrial agriculture." "Well, in my case, the system has succeeded," James said, the words bitter in his mouth. "I met with the bank this morning. I have 30 days to sell my livestock before they foreclose." Alex stopped walking, her expression shocked. "James, I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were that dire." He shrugged, embarrassed by his candor. "It is what it is. I've tried everything I could think of to keep afloat. Sometimes you just have to know when you're beaten." "What will happen to the animals?" she asked. "I'll sell what I can to other local farmers. The rest will go to auction." James couldn't meet her eyes as he said this, knowing that many animals sold at auction ended up in far worse conditions than his farm provided. They had reached the porch, and James gestured toward the house. "Would you like some coffee? It's nothing fancy, just regular drip coffee." "I'd love some," Alex replied, following him inside. In the kitchen, James busied himself with the coffee maker, while Alex sat at the table, her camera now resting beside her. Max settled at her feet, apparently content to nap after exploring the farm grounds. "James," Alex said after a moment, What if there was another option for your farm? Something that could keep you on this land and keep your animals safe? James turned, coffee pot in hand. What do you mean? I work with several organizations that fund farm animal sanctuaries, she explained, leaning forward slightly. Places where animals can live out their natural lives in humane conditions. Some of these sanctuaries also incorporate sustainable farming practices, educational programs, and even tourism. James poured the coffee slowly, considering her words. You're suggesting I turn my farm into some kind of animal sanctuary? Alex nodded, accepting the mug he offered. It wouldn't happen overnight, but yes. The organization I primarily work with, Compassionate Fields, has helped convert several struggling farms across the country. They provide funding, marketing support, and expertise in exchange for a commitment to certain animal welfare standards. James sat down across from her, skepticism evident in his expression. And how exactly would that work? I'm a farmer, not a tour guide, and my animals are livestock, not pets. It's not about turning working animals into pets, Alex clarified. It's about finding a balance where animals can serve a purpose while still being treated humanely throughout their lives. Some of our partner farms still produce dairy products, eggs, and wool. The difference is in the approach and the transparency. James sipped his coffee, mind racing with questions. And this would somehow be more profitable than traditional farming? In many cases, yes, Alex replied. There's a growing market for ethically produced farm products. Plus, farm sanctuaries often generate income through tours, educational programs, volunteer programs, and donations. The idea seemed far-fetched, yet James couldn't help feeling a flicker of hope. How much would all this cost to set up? Because in case you haven't noticed, I'm not exactly flush with cash right now. That's where Compassionate Fields comes in, Alex explained. They provide startup grants and low-interest loans to qualifying farms. Based on what I've seen here, James, I think you'd qualify. You're already implementing many of the practices they look for. James ran a hand over his face, trying to process this unexpected possibility. You're really serious about this, aren't you? Completely serious, Alex confirmed. I've been involved in helping 5 farms transition to this model in the last 3 years. All of them are still operating successfully. For the first time in months, James felt a glimmer of possibility. What would be the first step? Alex's face brightened. I'd need to bring in a couple of colleagues to assess the property properly, but I've already taken enough photos today to start building a case. With your permission, I'd like to present your farm to the board as a potential project. And what would they want from me in return? James asked, still cautious. A commitment to certain animal welfare standards, transparency with visitors, and participation in educational outreach. Alex listed. Nothing that contradicts what you're already doing, from what I can see. You'd retain ownership of the property and decision-making authority over day-to-day operations. The proposal sounded too good to be true, which made James wary. Yet the alternative was losing everything in 30 days. What did he have to lose by exploring this option? All right, he said finally. I'm willing to hear more. But I'm not making any commitments until I understand exactly what this would entail. Alex's smile was radiant. That's all I'm asking for now. Would it be all right if I brought my colleagues by tomorrow? Time is obviously a factor here. James nodded, still feeling somewhat dazed by this unexpected turn of events. Tomorrow works. After Alex left, promising to return the following day with representatives from Compassionate Fields, James wandered through his farm with new eyes. Could this place really function as some kind of sanctuary? Would people actually pay to visit a small farm like his? The idea seemed absurd on its face, yet he couldn't deny the passion and conviction in Alexandra's voice when she spoke about the project. If nothing else, it offered a sliver of hope where previously there had been none. That evening, James found himself researching farm sanctuaries online. The examples he found ranged from small operations focused solely on animal rescue to elaborate setups with visitor centers, educational programs, and substantial retail operations selling everything from farm products to themed merchandise. He also looked deeper into Alexandra Winters herself. Beyond her professional credentials, which were impressive, he discovered that she had grown up on a small dairy farm in Vermont. Her father had lost that farm to foreclosure when Alex was a teenager, a biographical detail that suddenly contextualized her interest in his situation. By the time James went to bed that night, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. He still harbored doubts about the viability of Alexandra's proposal, but for the first time in months, he fell asleep thinking about a future rather than an ending. True to her word, Alexandra arrived the next day with 2 colleagues. Dr. Michael Chen, a veterinarian specializing in farm animals, and Gabriela Suarez, an operations consultant for Compassionate Fields. Max once again accompanied them, seemingly delighted to be back at the farm. The assessment was thorough. Dr. Chen examined each animal on the property, making notes on their health, living conditions, and behavior. Gabriela toured the buildings and land, asking detailed questions about water sources, power infrastructure, and accessibility. Alexandra documented everything with her camera, occasionally conferring quietly with her colleagues. James followed them through the process, alternating between hope and skepticism. The more questions they asked, the more he realized how much work a transition would involve. Yet their professional approach and obvious expertise gradually eroded his initial doubts. Over lunch sandwiches they brought with them, the 3 visitors laid out their preliminary thoughts. "Your farm has excellent bones, Mr. Holden," Gabriela began, spreading a map of the property on the kitchen table. "The location is ideal, close enough to the city to attract visitors, but rural enough to provide genuine farm experience. Your buildings need some work, but they're structurally sound. The pasture rotation system you've implemented is already aligned with our sustainability guidelines." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "And your animals are in remarkably good health, especially considering your financial constraints. That speaks to your commitment and skill as a caretaker," Alexandra added. "Based on what we've seen today, I believe we can present a strong case to the board for expedited consideration of your application." "Application?" James repeated. "I haven't applied for anything yet. We've taken the liberty of preparing the initial paperwork," Alexandra explained, pulling a folder from her bag. "If you're interested in proceeding, we can submit this as soon as you've had a chance to review it." James accepted the folder, feeling a mix of gratitude and wariness. "And the timeline?" "The bank is moving forward with foreclosure in 30 days. Gabriela looked to Alexandra, who answered confidently, "If the board approves your application, and I believe they will, we can secure emergency funding to address the immediate financial crisis within 2 weeks. The full transition would take longer, of course, but the initial funding would allow you to halt the foreclosure process." The prospect seemed almost too convenient, raising James's suspicions again. "Why me? There must be dozens of failing farms in this county alone. What makes mine special?" The 3 visitors exchanged glances before Alexandra replied. "Several factors, actually. Your existing animal welfare practices align with our values. Your farm's size and location are ideal for our purposes. And frankly, James, your personal philosophy toward farming based on what I've observed and what you've shared suggests you'd be an excellent partner for this project." There was a sincerity in her expression that was difficult to doubt. Still, James needed to be certain. "And if I go through with this, what happens to my identity as a farmer? Do I become some kind of zookeeper? A tour guide showing city people around a petting zoo?" Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Holden, I grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas. My father and grandfather were traditional ranchers. When we transitioned to a more sustainable, welfare-centered model, my father had the same concerns you're expressing now. But he found that his identity as a steward of the land and animals actually deepened. He was still a farmer, just a different kind of farmer." The veterinarian's words resonated with James in a way the others hadn't. "I'd need to think about this," he said finally. "It's a lot to process." "Of course," Alexandra agreed immediately. "Take the time you need. But perhaps we could schedule a visit to one of our existing sanctuary farms? Seeing the operation in person might help you make a decision." The suggestion was reasonable, and James found himself nodding. "I could do that." "When?" "How about the day after tomorrow?" Alexandra suggested. There's a converted dairy farm about 2 hours from here that shares many similarities with your property. The plan was set. James would visit the sanctuary farm with Alexandra, while their colleagues would return to the city to begin preliminary work on his application. As they were leaving, Alexandra hung back, her expression serious. "James, I want you to know that I understand what you're going through. My family lost our farm when I was 16. It nearly destroyed my father." The personal revelation confirmed what James had discovered in his research. "Is that why you do this work now?" She nodded. "Partly. I saw firsthand how the system is stacked against small farmers. But I also believe that farming can be done differently in a way that honors both the animals and the people who care for them." After they left, James spent the evening reviewing the application materials they'd provided. The proposal was detailed and thorough, outlining a 3-phase transition plan that would gradually convert his traditional farm into what they called a working sanctuary. Surprisingly, many aspects of his current operation would remain intact, though modified to meet higher welfare standards. The financial projections were equally detailed, showing potential revenue streams from various sources: farm product sales, educational programs, tourism, and grants. The startup costs were substantial, but Compassionate Fields would cover most of these through a combination of grants and low-interest loans. 2 days later, James found himself walking beside Alexandra through Green Valley Farm Sanctuary, a converted dairy operation now functioning as a successful educational center and animal sanctuary. The owner, a former conventional farmer named Harold Jenkins, gave them a candid tour of the property. "I was skeptical as hell when Alex first approached me," Harold confessed as they walked through a barn housing retired dairy cows. "Thought it was some city-folk nonsense that would never work in the real world. But 4 years in, and we're not just staying afloat, we're thriving." James observed the operation with a critical eye, noting the practical solutions Harold had implemented to balance animal welfare with operational efficiency. The farm still produced milk from a small herd of cows, but the animals were given far more space and individual attention than in conventional dairies. Retired cows lived out their lives in a separate pasture, serving as educational ambassadors for school groups and visitors. "What was the hardest part of the transition?" James asked, as they watched volunteers working with some of the animals. Harold considered the question carefully. "Mentally adjusting to the new model. I'd say I was a third-generation dairy farmer. My identity was wrapped up in producing as much milk as possible. Switching to a model where animal welfare comes first and production second, that took some getting used per bee to. And financially, the first year was tight," Harold admitted. "Lots of changes, lots of construction. But by year 2, we were breaking even, and by year 3, turning a profit. Now we employ more people than my conventional dairy ever did, and I sleep better at night knowing no animal on my property is suffering." End quote. As they continued the tour, James noted the diverse revenue streams the farm had developed. A farm store selling ethically produced dairy products and branded merchandise. A small cafe serving farm-to-table meals, educational workshops for schools and community groups, and a volunteer program that provided free labor in exchange for experience. By the end of the visit, James found his skepticism largely eroded. Harold's operation was still fundamentally a working farm, just with a different set of priorities and additional dimensions. The animals were clearly well cared for, the land was managed sustainably, and perhaps most importantly, Harold himself seemed content and purposeful in his work. On the drive back, Alexandra let James process what he'd seen in silence for several miles before asking, "What did you think?" James gazed out at the passing landscape, farmland interspersed with patches of forest and the occasional small town. "It's not what I expected," he admitted. "It's still a real farm, just expanded somehow." Alexandra nodded. "That's exactly right. We're not trying to end farming. We're trying to evolve it, to create a model that works for animals, farmers, and consumers alike." "Harold seems happy," James observed. "He is now," Alexandra confirmed. The transition wasn't always easy for him. There were moments of doubt, resistance to certain changes, but he committed to the process, and it paid off. They drove in comfortable silence for several more miles before James spoke again. "I think I want to do this. I don't see another path forward that keeps me on my land." Alexandra's expression brightened. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already spoken with our board. They've reviewed your preliminary application and are prepared to move forward immediately if you give the go-ahead." The speed of this development surprised James. "That quickly? Don't they usually take weeks to review applications?" Alexandra hesitated before answering. "Normally, yes, but your situation is time-sensitive, and to be completely honest, I've been advocating strongly on your behalf. The fact that you're already implementing many welfare-oriented practices on your own initiative makes you an ideal candidate from our perspective." The pieces suddenly clicked into place for James. "You've been planning this since you first saw my farm, haven't you, when you came to get Max?" Alexandra had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Not planning exactly, but assessing. In my line of work, I've seen hundreds of farms. I can tell quickly which ones have potential for our program. When I saw how you kept your animals, how you spoke about them, Bix, I knew you might be a good fit." "So your dog getting caught in my fence, that was just a lucky coincidence?" James asked, unable to keep a note of skepticism from his voice. "Completely unplanned, I promise," Alexandra laughed. "Max has never run off like that before. But I won't deny that it created an opportunity I might not have had otherwise." James found himself smiling despite the lingering suspicion that he'd somehow been maneuvered into this situation. "Well, planned or not, I'm grateful. Without this option, I'd be losing everything in a matter of weeks." By the time they returned to James's farm, the basic framework of a plan had been established. Alexandra would submit his completed application to the Compassionate Fields Board tomorrow, with approval likely within days. Emergency funding would be dispersed to address the immediate financial crisis, halting the foreclosure process. Then the real work would begin, the gradual transformation of Holden Farm into Holden Farm Sanctuary. The following week passed in a blur of activity. The board approved James's application with remarkable speed, and the promised funds arrived in his bank account just in time to negotiate a stay of foreclosure with Patrick Reynolds, who seemed both surprised and relieved that James had found a solution. Alexandra and her team became a constant presence at the farm, working with James to develop a detailed transition plan. The first phase would focus on necessary repairs and modifications to existing structures, creating a small visitor center in a converted outbuilding, and establishing educational signage throughout the property. "We'll start small," Gabriella explained during one planning session. "Limited visiting hours, perhaps just weekends at first. As word spreads and interest grows, we can expand the operation gradually." James found himself increasingly engaged in the process, his initial reservations giving way to cautious enthusiasm. The plan they were developing preserved the essence of his farming operation, while adding new dimensions that actually excited him. "You know, I've been thinking about that north pasture," he told Alexandra one evening as they sat on his porch, reviewing plans. "It's always been underutilized. We could convert part of it into a demonstration area for sustainable grazing practices." Alexandra smiled, pleased by his growing investment in the project. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Your knowledge of this land and these animals is our greatest asset." As days passed, James found himself opening up more to Alexandra about his struggles, both financial and personal. The isolation of farm life, especially after his parents' passing, had taken a toll that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "There were days I wouldn't speak to another human being," he admitted during a break in their planning. "Just me and the animals. And while I love this land, that kind of solitude can wear on you." Alexandra nodded in understanding. "The sanctuary model addresses that too. You'll have staff, volunteers, visitors, a community built around shared values." The concept of community resonated deeply with James. His parents had been part of a tight-knit farming community, with neighbors helping neighbors during harvest or emergencies. That sense of connection had gradually eroded as small farms failed and corporate agriculture expanded in the region. 3 weeks into the transition process, the first visible changes began to take shape around the farm. The barnyard had been cleaned and reorganized, with fresh gravel paths connecting different areas. The old equipment shed was being converted into a welcome center, with large windows installed to provide views of the pastures beyond. James's farmhouse, too, was undergoing a transformation. A team of volunteers had arrived one Saturday morning to help with repairs and painting. By sunset, the peeling white exterior had been refreshed, shutters repaired, and the sagging front porch stabilized. "I barely recognize the place," James commented to Alexandra as they surveyed the day's progress from the newly solid porch steps. "That's just the beginning," she promised. "Wait until you see what happens when the educational areas are complete." The following week brought the first major challenge to their developing partnership. Dr. Chen had completed health assessments of all the animals on the property and presented his recommendations for improvements to their living conditions. Most were reasonable adjustments that James readily accepted, but one point became contentious. "We're recommending that the dairy cows be transitioned to a non-production role," Dr. Chen explained during a meeting in James's kitchen. "Given their age and the stress of continued milking, it would be better for their welfare to retire them to pasture life." James stiffened. "Those cows represent one of the few reliable income sources I have left. You're asking me to eliminate that entirely?" Alexandra intervened smoothly. "Not eliminate, James. Transition. The funding model we're developing includes compensation for production income lost during the conversion process. It's not just about the money," James argued. "I'm a dairy farmer. My father was a dairy farmer. Those cows are part of what defines this as a working farm, not just a petting zoo." The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Chen began to respond, but Alexandra held up a hand to stop him. "James, would you show me the dairy operation again? Just you and me?" He nodded stiffly, and they walked in silence to the small barn where his 4 dairy cows were housed. Inside, the animals stood in clean stalls with access to an outdoor yard. Modest as it was, James took pride in the cleanliness and organization of this space. "Talk me through your process here," Alexandra requested, her tone free of judgment. James described his twice-daily milking routine, the care he took with each animal, the small batch processing he did to sell milk and cheese at the local farmers market. As he spoke, his initial defensiveness gradually subsided. "These cows are treated better than most," he concluded. "They have space, proper feed, regular veterinary care." Alexandra nodded. "I can see that. And I understand what this represents to you." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "What if we created a demonstration dairy? Smaller scale, perhaps with new, younger animals eventually. A place where visitors could learn about ethical dairy production. The current cows could be gradually retired, but the tradition and knowledge you carry wouldn't be lost." The compromise wasn't perfect, but it acknowledged what James hadn't been able to articulate: his fear of losing connection to his family's legacy. They continued discussing possibilities as they walked back to the house, the tension between them easing with each step. By the time they rejoined Dr. Chen, they had outlined a modified plan that would preserve elements of the dairy operation while still improving welfare conditions for the aging cows. The veterinarian listened attentively before offering his professional endorsement of the compromise. This pattern repeated itself several times during the transition process. Alexandra proved remarkably skilled at finding middle ground between traditional farming practices and animal welfare concerns, always respecting James's experience while gently pushing for improvements. 6 weeks into the project, the farm hosted its first small group of visitors board members from Compassionate Fields who had traveled to see the progress firsthand. James found himself unexpectedly nervous as he led the tour, Alexandra at his side providing context and background information. "What we're creating here," she explained to the group as they stood in the newly renovated barn, "is a model that honors traditional farming knowledge while implementing contemporary welfare standards. James's expertise is the foundation upon which we're building." Her words warmed him, acknowledging his contribution in a way that felt genuine rather than patronizing. Throughout the tour, he noticed how she consistently positioned him as a partner and expert, rather than a recipient of charity. The board members were clearly impressed, asking insightful questions and offering constructive suggestions. One elderly woman, introduced as the founding donor of Compassionate Fields, pulled James aside as the group was preparing to leave. "Young man," she said, her voice warm but authoritative, "I've funded dozens of these transitions over the years. Some succeed brilliantly. Others struggle. Do you know what makes the difference?" James shook his head. "The farmer," she stated simply. "When the farmer truly embraces the new model, not just tolerates it for financial reasons, that's when magic happens. I see that potential in you." Her words stayed with James long after the visitors had departed. That evening, sitting alone on his porch, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Not just the physical improvements to the farm, but his own perspective. He found himself genuinely excited about aspects of the project that initially he had merely accepted as necessary compromises. The next significant milestone came 2 months into the transition, when the farm hosted its first public open house. The event had been Alexandra's idea, soft opening to introduce the local community to the concept of the sanctuary farm. "Many of your neighbors probably have misconceptions about what we're doing here," she had explained. "This gives them a chance to see for themselves before rumors start flying." James had agreed, though with trepidation. His relationships with neighboring farmers had grown distant in recent years as he struggled financially, while some of them expanded or modernized their operations. On the day of the open house, James was surprised by the turnout. Dozens of local families arrived, curious to see the changes taking place at the Holden farm. Alexandra had arranged for educational stations throughout the property, staffed by volunteers who explained various aspects of sustainable farming and animal welfare. James found himself stationed near the sheep pasture, answering questions about wool production and explaining how shearing, when done properly, benefited the animals. He was in the middle of a demonstration when he noticed Frank Harmon, owner of the largest conventional dairy operation in the county, standing at the back of the group with his arms crossed skeptically. When the demonstration concluded and the visitors moved on to the next station, Frank approached. "So it's true then," he said by way of greeting. "You've gone over to the tree huggers." James felt a flash of the old defensiveness, but kept his tone even. "I've found a way to keep my farm, Frank, a different way than what my father taught me, but one that still respects the animals and the land." Frank glanced around at the improvements, the new signage, the visitors. "And these city folks? They don't try to tell you how to run your own property? How to handle your own animals?" It was a fair question, one that had concerned James himself initially. "It's a partnership," he explained. "They bring expertise in certain areas, I bring it in others. We compromise where we need to." Frank didn't look convinced. "Just seems like a fancy way to admit defeat to me. Real farmers don't need handouts from activist organizations." The comment stung, hitting directly at James's lingering insecurities about the transition. Before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Mr. Harmon, isn't it? I'm Alexandra Winters." Alex had appeared beside them, offering her hand to Frank, who shook it reflexively. "I understand your concerns," she continued smoothly. "Many farmers we work with initially share them. Would you be interested in seeing the financial projections for this operation once the transition is complete? The sanctuary model isn't charity, it's a sustainable business approach that happens to prioritize animal welfare alongside profitability." End quote. Her direct, businesslike approach seemed to catch Frank off guard. "I might take a look," he conceded, "though I doubt it would work for an operation of my size." "You'd be surprised," Alexandra replied. "We've worked with farms ranging from 5 acres to 500. Each transition is customized to the specific property and farmer's needs." The conversation continued, with Frank gradually shifting from hostility to grudging curiosity. By the time he left, he had taken Alexandra's card and agreed to review some materials about the program. "Sorry about that," James said after Frank had walked away. "He's old school. Thinks change is always for the worse." Alexandra smiled. "Don't apologize. Those are exactly the conversations we need to be having in farming communities. Change doesn't happen without resistance." As the day progressed, James found himself increasingly comfortable in his role as host and educator. The visitors seemed genuinely interested in the farm's transformation, asking thoughtful questions and expressing support for the project. Several local families signed up to become regular volunteers, and a nearby school teacher inquired about bringing her class for educational visits. By sunset, when the last visitors had departed, James felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. Exhausted but energized, he joined Alexandra and the volunteer team for a celebratory dinner in the farmhouse kitchen. "I'd call that a resounding success," Gabriella announced, raising her glass in a toast. 27 volunteer sign-ups, 15 potential regular visitors, and 3 inquiries about educational programs. Better than we projected for a first event. The team cheered, and James found himself smiling broadly. The farm felt alive in a way it hadn't since his parents were still living full of purpose and possibility, rather than looming failure. Later that evening, after the others had left, Alexandra lingered to help James clean up. They worked together comfortably, their initial wariness having evolved into a genuine friendship over the past months. "Did today feel like what you expected?" she asked as she dried the last of the dishes. "Running a sanctuary farm?" James considered the question seriously. "Yes and no. It's still farming, still caring for animals and land. But there's a community element I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did." Alexandra nodded. "That's what I love about this model. It bridges worlds that have grown too separate, rural and urban, production and conservation." "Speaking of bridges," James said, remembering a conversation from earlier in the day. "That teacher who wanted to bring her class, Lisa Reynolds, mentioned she's looking for experts to talk to her students about sustainable agriculture. I told her you might be interested." Alexander looked surprised. "Me? You're the farmer here. And you're the sustainability expert," James countered. "Besides, her class is studying citizen advocacy. Your journey from farm kid to conservation leader would probably inspire them." Alexander's expression softened. "That's kind of you to say. And yes, I'd be happy to speak with her class." As they finished cleaning, their conversation turned to plans for the coming months. The transition was progressing ahead of schedule, with the first official sanctuary program set to launch in just a few weeks. "By this time next year," Alexandra predicted as she prepared to leave, "you won't recognize this place. Or rather, you'll recognize its heart, but not its reach." Her words proved prophetic. The months that followed brought rapid change to Holden Farm Sanctuary. The visitor center was completed and staffed with part-time educators. A volunteer program attracted both locals and college students from nearby universities. Educational workshops on sustainable farming practices began drawing participants from across the state. James found himself growing into his new role with unexpected ease. He still performed many of the same daily tasks, feeding animals, maintaining fences, monitoring pasture conditions, but now these actions were contextualized within a larger mission that gave them renewed meaning. 9 months into the transition, the financial picture had stabilized completely. The emergency funding from Compassionate Fields had evolved into a structured business plan with diverse revenue streams. Visitor fees, educational programs, ethically produced farm products, and a growing base of regular donors who supported the sanctuary's mission. James's relationship with Alexandra had evolved as well. What began as a professional partnership had deepened into something more personal. They found themselves spending time together beyond what the project required. Dinners in town, hikes through the countryside, long conversations about everything from agricultural policy to favored books. "I never thank you properly," James said one evening as they walked the farm's perimeter, checking fences, a task he once performed alone but now enjoyed sharing. "Not just for the financial rescue, but for helping me see my farm differently." Alexandra glanced at him, her expression softening in the golden light of sunset. "You don't need to thank me. What we've created here is exactly what I always hoped was possible, a place that honors both animals and the people who care for them." "Still," James insisted, "if Max hadn't gotten tangled in my fence that day, if you hadn't seen something worth saving here, I think we were meant to cross paths," Alexandra said simply. "My father always said there are no coincidences in farming, just seasons we don't yet understand." The wisdom in that statement resonated with James. His own father had often spoken of farming as a series of cycles, birth and death, planting and harvest, struggle and abundance. Perhaps this transformation of his farm was simply another turn in that eternal cycle. Not an ending, but a new beginning. 1 year to the day after James had received the foreclosure notice, Holden Farm Sanctuary hosted its official grand opening celebration. The event drew hundreds of visitors, including local officials, media representatives, and farming families from across the region. The farm was nearly unrecognizable from its former state. The buildings had been repaired and repainted, educational signage guided visitors through various areas, and the animals, some new, some familiar, appeared content in their spacious habitats. Most importantly, the atmosphere had transformed from one of isolation and struggle to one of community and purpose. As James took the microphone to welcome the gathered crowd, he caught sight of Patrick Reynolds from the bank standing near the back, nodding approvingly at the transformation. Frank Harmon was there too. Still skeptical perhaps, but curious enough to have brought his grandchildren to see the new operation. "A year ago," James began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "this farm was on the verge of becoming another statistic, another family operation lost to economic pressures. Today, it stands as something new yet, somehow connected to its roots." He described the journey briefly, emphasizing the partnership with Compassionate Fields and the support of the local community. As he spoke, he noticed Alexandra watching from the side, her expression a mix of pride and something deeper. "What we've created here isn't just a sanctuary for animals," James continued. "It's a sanctuary for a way of life that values connection to the land, to animals, and to each other. Everyone who visits, volunteers, or supports this place becomes part of that connection." After his speech, as visitors dispersed to explore the sanctuary, Alexandra approached him with Max trotting faithfully by her side. "That was beautiful, James," she said. "You've become quite the ambassador for the cause." He smiled, thinking how much had changed between them since their first meeting. "I had a good teacher, several actually." He noted to scratch Max behind the ears, "including this guy, who knew exactly which fence to get stuck in." Alexandra laughed. "He's always had good instincts about people." Together they walked through the sanctuary, greeting visitors and answering questions. The day passed in a blur of activity, and it was evening before they found a moment alone, sitting on the farmhouse porch as the last visitors departed. "So," Alexandra said, "how does it feel?" 1 year later, mission accomplished. James considered her question carefully. "Not accomplished, just begun. There's still so much we can do here." He paused, realizing he'd said, "we," without thinking. "That is, if you're planning to stay involved now that the transition is complete." Alexandra turned to face him directly. "James, I haven't just been investing in this farm. I've been investing in you and us. Whatever comes next for Holden Farm Sanctuary, I hope we face it together." The simple declaration confirmed what James had been feeling, but hadn't quite found the words to express. Their partnership had grown beyond professional collaboration into something deeply personal. In saving his farm, Alexandra had helped him rediscover parts of himself. He'd lost hope, purpose, and the capacity for connection. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Very much." As twilight settled over the sanctuary, James reflected on the journey of the past year. What had begun with a desperate farmer finding a stray dog had transformed not just his land, but his life. The animals under his care now had a secure future. Visitors would learn about compassionate farming practices, and he himself had found a new purpose that honored his family's legacy while creating something uniquely meaningful. Max, who had been dozing on the porch between them, suddenly lifted his head, ears perked toward the road. A moment later, they heard the sound of a car approaching, late visitors perhaps, or volunteers returning for forgotten items. "Should we see who that is?" Alexandra suggested, rising from her chair. James shook his head, gently taking her hand to keep her beside him. "They know where to find us if they need us. Right now, I just want to enjoy this moment." As they sat together watching the stars emerge above their sanctuary, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The farm that had nearly been lost was now found again, transformed, but somehow more authentically itself than ever before. And he too had been transformed, discovering that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, even in the shape of a mud-caked border collie caught in a fence on a rainy afternoon. In the barn, the animals settled for the night, secure in their renovated habitats. In the fields, new crops grew that would feed both sanctuary residents and visitors. And on the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built, James Holden finally felt the certainty that had eluded him for so long, the knowledge that his family's legacy wouldn't end with him, but would instead evolve into something his ancestors might not have imagined, but would surely have approved. The struggling farm had found new life as a sanctuary, just as he himself had found a new path forward. And it had all begun with an act of simple kindness, a farmer helping a stray dog, unaware that in saving the animal, he was opening the door to his own salvation.